Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're jumping straight into a brand new explainer that breaks down a really provocative, frankly mind-bending analysis that's been gaining a ton of traction online. This source material offers a fascinating, completely alternative lens for viewing current global events. It basically argues that all these recent super aggressive U.S. financial crackdowns and counterterrorism moves, well, they aren't just random isolated policy shifts. The analyst claims they're actually a highly coordinated strike against a massive, hidden, historical geopolitical target. The original researcher weaves together a ton of data. We're talking Treasury Department actions, declassified British intelligence files, and Latin American cartel indictments to present this grand unifying theory of global finance and irregular warfare. So we're going to meticulously deconstruct this argument right now, step by step, to understand exactly how the source connects these seemingly impossible dots. Okay, let's dive into this. The source material actually anchors its entire thesis on some recent, very pointed remarks made by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. This was at a G7 finance ministers meeting over in Paris. He was addressing his global counterparts about tariff financing, and he delivered this really blunt directive. He said that crushing the threat of terrorism compels everyone to step up, and crucially, he added, there must also be no room for excuses. Now, the researcher behind our source material immediately highlights that specific phrase, no room for excuses. They argued this wasn't just standard, polite diplomatic rhetoric. No, they claim this was a highly targeted warning aimed directly at specific so-called allies sitting right there in the room. To really wrap our heads around the source's perspective, we need to look at the massive gap between the official government narrative and the core claim of this analysis. Officially, if you read the mainstream press or government press releases, they state that these intense financial crackdowns are squarely aimed at Iran, right? Its oil, its proliferation networks. But the source argues that Iran is literally just the surface-level pretext. The claimed true target of this financial warfare, according to the analysis we're unpacking today, is actually the City of London and its vast historical offshore financial empire. The theory posits that the current U.S. administration is just using Iran's sanctions as a convenient tool to dismantle a much older, deeply entrenched global network. So here is the roadmap for how we're going to break down this sprawling theory. First, the no excuses thesis. Second, tracing Treasury sanctions. Third, the Muslim Brotherhood claims. Fourth, the war on cartels. And finally, targeting the empire. Part 1. The no excuses thesis. So the crucial point is exactly who Treasury Secretary Bessent was calling out. He didn't just speak in vague, sweeping terms about terror financing. He named very specific operational mechanisms. He explicitly called out shell companies embedded within Europe, shadow banking networks lurking across the Middle East, and drug cartels operating across the Western Hemisphere. The source analysis latches onto the specific list like a laser. They argue, look, this is absolutely not a description of Iran's domestic economy. Instead, the analyst insists that this list is a textbook, perfectly accurate description of the City of London's offshore operations and its historical reliance on what the source calls narco-terrorist financial flows. Moving on to Part 2, tracing Treasury sanctions. To try and prove this theory, the analysis points us directly to the data from the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. The source basically says, hey, read the fine print of these recent sanctions, because while the giant press release headlines scream Iran, the actual corporate addresses of the sanctions entities tell a completely different story. The source pulls up specific examples right from the OFAC list. You've got Mousavi, an alleged Hezbollah financing network, and Thriving Times International, an Exchange Has network. Where are they located? London. Then it names Global Fortune Shipping and Science Obedient International. These are oil or LNG tankers. Again, London addresses. And finally, it points to a company called Sparkling Courage Limited, headquartered out in the British Virgin Islands. You have to admit, it's a really surprising geographic trail for sanctions that are supposedly targeting the Middle East. The source uses this data to boldly claim the real financial trail leads straight back to British soil. And building right on top of those geographic connections, the source material brings up an event it claims the mainstream media totally ignored. It asserts that during a recent meeting in Washington about Operation Economic Fury, which is the U.S. initiative targeting Iran's financing, Bessent actually issued a direct exclusive warning to the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves. According to the analysis, Reeves was the only finance minister singled out like this. For the source, this just further cements the theory that London, not Tehran, is the administration's true focus of accountability here. Okay, so we've seen how the source links modern shadow banking and shipping companies to British addresses. But how does this financial spreadsheet stuff connect to the physical, violent acts of global terrorism we see in the news? Well, to answer that, the analysis takes a massive leap back in time.
Part 3. The Muslim Brotherhood Claims.
Right here, the source material pivots hard to a newly released White House counterterrorism strategy, and it highlights a truly explosive paragraph. The document states completely unequivocally that all modern jihadi groups, from al-Qaeda to ISIS to Hamas, can trace their roots back to one single foundational organization. The quote literally reads, "The Muslim Brotherhood is the root of all modern Islamist terrorism, predicated on recreating the Muslim Caliphate." For the analysts we're following, this is a total bombshell admission from the highest levels of the U.S. government. It unifies the entire origin story of global terror. Let's move to the source's chronological timeline to see how this builds. We start way back in 1928. The analysis asks a really poignant question. If the Brotherhood is the roots, who actually planted the seed? Well, the timeline claims that in 1928, in Ismailia, Egypt, British intelligence and the British Suez Canal Company literally helped found and base the Muslim Brotherhood to use as a weapon against nationalist movements in the Middle East. Fast forward decades later, and the source points to heavily researched books like Robert Dreyfuss's Devil's Game and Mark Curtis's Secret Affairs, which use declassified documents to outline all these covert UK ties. And that brings us to the present day, where we see the current U.S. administration actively designating specific branches of this very same organization as foreign terrorist organizations. And here is exactly where the analysis claims all the historical puzzle pieces finally snap together. The White House recently took the historic step of designating 3 specific chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organizations: the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Lebanese chapters. Now, leaning heavily on the research of author Mark Curtis, the source points out a wild correlation. According to Curtis's review of declassified British Foreign Office files, these are the exact same 3 chapters that appear in historical records as operational assets built, funded, and deployed by London. So for the original researcher, this isn't a coincidence. It's proof that the U.S. is deliberately, surgically, targeting a network historically cultivated by British intelligence. So, all right, we've got Middle Eastern geopolitics, historical intelligence ops, and London show companies. But remember earlier, the source also prominently mentioned drug cartels across the Western Hemisphere. How on earth do Latin American cartels fit into this overarching theory of a London-centric global network? It seems like a huge stretch, right? Let's look at Part 4, the War on Cartels. To explain the sudden, massive crackdown on networks in the Americas, the source points to one absolutely staggering statistic from the Maine National Drug Control Strategy. Over the past 5 years, nearly 500,000 Americans have been killed by drug overdosing and poisoning, 500,000. To put that into perspective, the analysis is quick to point out that this number actually exceeds the combined American military losses of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Because the death toll is literally at a wartime level, the source argues the administration has completely stopped treating drug trafficking as a standard criminal justice issue. They are now treating it as an actual, literal war. And this brilliantly illustrates how that wartime footing translates directly into action on the ground. The analysis maps out 3 massive consecutive hits against the cartels that happened in just a matter of weeks. Boom, boom, boom. Step 1. In a totally unprecedented move, a leader of the violent gang Tren de Audibla was extradited from Colombia to the U.S. on terrorism charges. Step 2. Over in Puerto Rico, federal prosecutors used the RICO Act to hand down 23 indictments, basically deleting an entire criminal enterprise known as La Familia Nuna Muera in one single sweep. Step 3. The sitting governor of Sinaloa in Mexico was indicted by the Southern District of New York for allegedly conspiring with cartels for political gain, which resulted in Mexico freezing his bank accounts. The analysis argues that executing this level of complex cross-border takedown requires unprecedented cooperation. It requires that wartime footing. To back this up, the source includes a really telling quote from FBI Director Kash Patel. He explains that the administration's incredibly aggressive approach, which actually includes embedding U.S. intelligence agencies right inside Mexican state security buildings, has allowed them to extrapolate on these criminal networks. Patel stated that this strategy allowed law enforcement to capture 8 of the FBI's top 10 most wanted in just a single year. Finally, Part 5, Targeting the Empire. Okay, we've covered the G7 warnings, the historical terrorism routes, and the cartel takedowns. To understand how the analyst ties all these disparate threads together into one grand final thesis, you really have to understand a specific piece of vocabulary they use: Dope Incorporated. This is the source's shorthand term for a theorized imperial financial network that has allegedly used irregular warfare, terrorism, and global drug trafficking as literal tools of geopolitical control, dating all the way back to Britain's Opium Wars in the 19th century. The ultimate overarching argument of the source material is that the current U.S. administration isn't just playing whack-a-mole with disparate crimes. No, they are treating Dope Incorporated as an active, unified enemy combatant on the world stage. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast. If you just watch standard evening broadcasts, the Iran sanctions, the Middle East terror designations, and the Latin American cartel arrests, well, they just look like the isolated, separate geopolitical silos you see on the left. But if you look through the framework of this specific analysis, they transform into the image on the right. They become a highly coordinated, multi-front financial and legal war against a 200-year-old apparatus, centralized in London's offshore banking system.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to ponder today. Based on the connections drawn in the source material we just unpacked, from Treasury Secretary Bessent's no excuses warning, to the curious London addresses on the OFAC sanctions list, to the historical origins of the Muslim Brotherhood, right down to the massive RICO indictments of the cartels, are we simply witnessing standard, albeit aggressive, foreign policy? Or, as the analyst insists, are we actually watching the real-time dismantling of a centuries-old global financial network hiding in plain sight? It's definitely a heavy concept to digest, but understanding how to read these historical and financial data points certainly changes the way you look at the daily news. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we will see you on the next explainer.